Hi, today we're here with Ilija Trojanow, who is a Bulgarian-German author who's written a lot of nonfiction books and novels, including one which I've recently finished called The Lamentations of Zeno, which was written in 2011 and translated into English about 5 years ago. I've reviewed it on my Instagram account, and I'm very fortunate to be joined by Ilija Trojanow today, who is in Vienna, to talk about the book and his wider bibliography. How are you, Ilija?
I'm very fine. Thanks, Charlie.
I have to say, I really admire your very strong background, your beautiful library. Where are you calling us from?
Well, this happens to be a part of Vienna that's really interesting. It's the so-called 9th Bezirk, the 9th district, which was the one of the kind of the centers of Viennese culture, with these beautiful Jugendstil, kind of end of the century buildings, and a lot of small cafes, small shops. It's a very lively area. One of my favorite places.
Sounds like an amazing place for writers to get inspiration and
yeah, it's actually full of culture. There's a high school around the corner where Billy Wilder and Fred Zinnemann were actually in the same class before the Nazis came. Yeah.
Oh wow! So, fun piece of history.
And Freud's study is like 300 yards away and stuff like that.
Okay, so in an area very rich in history. Well, that's brilliant. So just to sort of carry on with the introduction, you've got a really interesting origin story. You were born in Bulgaria. Your parents escaped in the 70s from the regime there to settle to Germany, but then later you moved to Kenya, where you spent most of your youth in Kenya, and since then you've moved around in various places, including India. And so I guess my first question is, how did all this movement and this very diverse history influence your desire to become a writer and inform that decision to become a writer?
Well, I think there are two aspects. One is the cosmopolitanism, and the other is the multilingualism. Basically, the number of people who have grown up with several languages amongst authors is quite high. Mm-hmm. And the reason is evident, that if you grew up with several languages, you are both in and outside of a language, meaning you have an intimate relationship. At the same time, you actually look at a language from outside, and therefore you are sometimes more skeptical, more reflective. You kind of tend to think things over. It's maybe more elaborate than someone who has grown up in one language and has only this one particular language at his disposal. And the other thing is, in my life's experience, if you become a cosmopolitan, there's no going back. So basically, if you find out that there's this wealth of diversity on so many levels, it's very, very difficult then to limit yourself to one certain, let's say, game of cultural interplay. So you become restless in a positive way. So it's kind of, there's an ongoing engine of curiosity that drives you forward. So in my life, I've always kind of been slightly afraid of getting bogged down. So I after my studies, I started a publishing house in Munich to promote African literature and books on Africa. After a while, it felt kind of, okay, I've done that, let's move on. I moved to Bombay, spent 6 years in Bombay. After that, I had to move on. I went to Cape Town. So this has been not something that is free choice. It's partly also driven by a kind of thirst for something new, for a new challenge.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Okay, so this novel that I've just finished, which I'm holding up here, The Lamentations of Zeno, which you wrote 10 years ago, it's broadly about climate change. More broadly, it's about disintegration of the planet, disintegration of a man's life, marriage, even sanity, shall we say. I'm quite curious to understand how you were inspired by that theme. What were sort of the inspirations behind the book? How did you come to that story?
Well, as a novelist, you rarely write about topics. You usually start off with either characters or scenes. So certain visions. In this case, it was a bad dream. I actually saw someone, an elderly gentleman, in a kind of moon landscape. And he was depressed, he was anguished, something was terribly wrong, existentially wrong. And it was so powerful, the image was so powerful, it woke me up. And then I thought to myself, okay, who is this man? And maybe the difference between a non-writing human being and an author is that we then start asking questions. So who is he? What is he doing there? And I can't tell you why. I had absolutely no exposure to the field of geology and glaciology. But for some bizarre reason, I thought this must be someone who has studied glaciers, and the glacier is gone. So this was my assumption. And all of my books are based on a lot of research. So I said to myself, okay, let me find out who is a leading glaciologist in Europe, and let me talk to that person. So it happened to be a man with a very Swiss name called Hebeli, who was very kind. He invited me into his study in Zurich, and he showed me long-term studies of glaciers in the Caucasus, so kind of between Europe and Asia. And it was devastating because 30 years ago, these glaciers were resplendent, white, majestic. A glacier is really a wonder to behold for anyone who hasn't seen one personally. And over time, they become gray, then they become dark. And because of that, they no longer reflect light and heat. And basically, they break up. And the very last image was just pockets of black ice. And underneath was just this barren landscape. And he said, well, you know, your dream is actually scientifically quite precise. So I thought to myself, okay, this man evidently wants to tell his story. And then I started looking at what's happening to our glaciers, which is just one of many, many aspects, of course, of climate change. And it occurred to me that actually it's a very good symbol of climate change, because glaciers are not only beautiful, they are very individual, something I didn't know. Each glacier has its own identity. So basically they float on the water so there's a film of water between the stone, the mountain, and the ice. And they have an individual soundscape, so that they sound differently. They melt away in a different tempo. They have a different visuality. I mean, it's like a sculpture, and each one is sculpted in a different way. So it is something that we can absolutely relate to on one side. On the other hand, a lot of human beings on this planet need glaciers for their water supply. So we depend on them, be it in Bolivia, for example, which is now threatened by the 3 major glaciers melting. Or a very good example is northern India. About 300 to 400 million people depend on the glaciers in the Himalayas. If they were to melt, and the recent studies say that that's probably going to happen by 2040, which is not far away, you basically have several hundred million people without any reliable water supply. So the effects are absolutely terrifying. So I thought to myself, the only way to write about climate change is through something that we humans understand and something we need, which is love. And so this was my first stepping stone. This man is not only a scientist, but he was actually in love with this glacier. And I thought to myself,
let me just interrupt you there, because it's interesting you answered the question with regard to specifically this love of glaciers, because for me, that was actually one of the most powerful moments in the novel, when he's near one of the glaciers and it's melting and it's dying, and it's almost like this glacier is a a living thing, a living organism, and he's heartbroken at what he's witnessing and the sounds that it's making as it is dying, which he's recognizing as the slow death of a glacier. So it's very interesting that you evoke the word love of glaciers, almost as if they are living organisms in a way.
It's difficult to define what is actually a living organism. It's something I didn't know before I researched this book. It's not that easy as we think. So in a way, part of the discussion is the concept of Gaia, for example, to look at the whole planet as a living organism. Basically, everything that changes, that would be one radical definition. Everything that changes is alive. From a different philosophical point of view. So it seemed to me absolutely necessary for this human being, his name is Zeno, to have that kind of intimate relationship with things that we might not care about. So that was, I think that's important, because one of the underlying topics and themes of the novel is that we don't care enough. I think that's a huge paradigm shift that we're experiencing at the moment, that we, from a rational point of view, we absolutely understand that we have to change the way we live, and we have to stop this destructive exploitation of the planet. But I don't think emotionally we care enough. So kind of keeping on this culture of consumption and overconsumption in part of the world seems to us to be, we're so needy in terms of consumption, seems to be more important than the love we have for the planet. So I really wanted to kind of find a way to express that within the novel, because this seems to be one of the real problems that we seem incapable of solving at the moment.
I felt that, especially given the ending, which I don't want to give away, I don't want to give away spoilers, but maybe there was a certain lack of faith in the redemption of humanity, that is it possible for us to turn this thing around or not? And there are certain satirical elements in the book, which I really enjoyed. For example, that artist, Dan Quentin, I thought was a very nice illustration of sort of the modern world and how we communicate these things. Do you feel that this is a sort of irredeemable issue, and that we're on a slow path to total destruction?
No, not at all. I get asked that question quite often, because some people are depressed because Zeno is a difficult guy to kind of I mean, just imagine he was your friend. He would be someone who would irritate you quite a lot, because he has this kind of moral rectitude, and he insists on certain things being on a kind of greater truth.
Very insistent on his values.
Yeah.
For example, with the episode with the Chilean soldier and getting into a fight over like this minor incident, and
exactly. So in a way, he is a hero that we would admire from afar. So I spent part of 2019 reading a lot and studying Gandhi, because I wrote an essay for a new translation of his autobiography. And it's a similar thing with Gandhi, that, if he is a portrait on the wall, it's easy to admire him. The more you know about him, the more irritating he becomes, because he insists on certain kind of on a certain moral fiber that's not very flexible. So we like to kind of compromise with our own morality in order to make life easier. So he has that kind of quality. Some people might not regard that as a quality. I mean, we live in an era of pragmatism, and people like that are sometimes regarded as weird, or maybe even crazy. But anyway, to get back to your question. So when you write a novel, one of the things you have to accept is there's a certain inner logic. So once he's the main character, his view of the world becomes the logic of the novel. And there's no way, if I want him to be plausible as the main character, there's no way of bringing in my own personal optimism into the story, because his experience is one of devastation and destruction. So that is why his kind of, well, I don't even think it's pessimism or negativity. It's just the utter shattering of any meaning of life. I mean, without this glacier, he has difficulty in understanding what else is there to live for. So in a way, it's a symbol of, you know, once we destroy certain aspects of this planet, life becomes meaningless, not only on a on the level of physics and chemistry, but also in biology, biology, but also on the level of the ethical kind of web that we construct and that we need to survive.
But so it's funny, you just used the word logic, the logic of Zeno. And actually at the end of every chapter, you create this structure where the second half of the chapter, a couple of pages at the end of the chapter, turns into a stream of consciousness, not particularly logic, almost like an oracular, you know.
Yeah, cacophonic.
Sorry?
It's a cacophonic.
Exactly. And also it was sort of predicting what's sort of slightly saying what's going to happen. And so how did that come about, this idea of having this quite rational approach at the beginning, and then at the end of every chapter it sort of breaks down?
Yeah, his voice is quite unique, stern, and logical. And I wanted to juxtapose that with the white noise of society. And so it's a collage of all sorts of stuff. It's songs, it's jingles, it's ads, it's a communication between ships, and it is partly, as you mentioned, bits and pieces of information that is kind of avant la lettre. That's kind of looking into a future, which just pleased me from, basically I was just playing around with that concept. But the main reason is that this is, I think, part of the problem, that we are surrounded by so much white noise that it's very, very difficult to hang on to a clear thought. And something very interesting happened. I had a reading in Hamburg, and a man came up to me after the reading and said, well, I found that very interesting, especially these cacophonic passages. I'm actually head of an advertising company. And I wanted to ask you, did you write these chapters because you're aware of how much advertising there is all around us? And I said, no, actually, I didn't know that. He said, how many ads do you think a human being is exposed to in a big European city per day? And I said, well, maybe a few hundred. And he said, a few thousand. Wow. And most of them are not, most of them are in place, but you don't perceive them consciously. So at different levels of subconscious interaction with advertising. And he said, basically, these chapters illustrate the fact that we are constantly bombarded by messaging that has no real meaning or importance besides the very kind of banal provocation to go and buy something. So sometimes, this is the wonderful thing about literature, sometimes you write about things that you don't know about, or sometimes you express certain aspects of life or society just through your instincts as an author. And it turns out that you've actually put your finger on something that you were not aware of.
Fantastic. Is there something of you in Zeno? I mean, you say it's a dream, but was there anything of yourself in him?
No, not at all. I'm far less rigid, and also he's very much rooted. He's a Bavarian, so that was very difficult to translate. My translator is from from Texas, but we decided not to give him, because in the German original, he partly speaks when he remembers his father and his provincial roots. He partly speaks Bavarian, but we decided not to use a particular kind of regional dialect or accent. And the reason being, of course, that it's far more difficult in English because you have so many different forms of English around the world. And he's very much part of this landscape. So as opposed to me, I'm very much all over the place, neither here nor there, and at the same time everywhere. So very, very different person. But one beautiful anecdote is the leading institute to study the North and South Pole is in a German city called Bremerhaven. Alfred Wegener Institute. It's kind of a very, very famous. They have their own ships. They do a lot of the research in the Antarctic. And there's a man there who is specialized on glaciers. And they supported my research. And then I presented the novel with some of their scientists in their headquarters. And then a lady came up to me and said, well, you know, this is my husband, and he's also from Bavaria. And since we read your novel, I started calling him Zeno because he's exactly the same guy that you've described.
What a compliment. Amazing. So he's Zeno. You're not Zeno, he is. Okay.
He is, yeah. I didn't know him before I wrote the book, but basically when you write a novel, you enter the mental and emotional landscape, especially of the main character. So it's difficult actually to answer your question truthfully, because of course you inhabit such a person in a way that there's probably a kind of cohabitation of minds. So it will be difficult. I'm sure that he is maybe not what I am, but he's partly what I might like to be. So it's a very complex interaction between the main character and the author, which is also informed partly by wishes and aspirations.
Okay, let's talk about your earlier bibliography. One of your first books was, I'm going to say the English title, I can't say it in German. It was called The World is Big and Redemption is Everywhere, which I'm not sure if that's been translated into English for some of
No, it hasn't.
Oh, it hasn't. Okay. But that book, as I understand it, deals with your family's migration. And I'm just curious to understand how that was for you as a process. What was that like to write about something so personal? And it was eventually adapted into a movie. So that process sort of got elongated. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's well, most first novels are autobiographical, if not in the plot, at least as a theme, as a topic. In that case, it actually is based on us fleeing Bulgaria, but it's not autobiographical in that what the main character experiences is what I experienced. But of course, it's profoundly rooted in the way as a kid that you go through such a rupture. And what I wanted to write about is that part of the discourse on migration, especially on a kind of potentially dangerous, violent migration, it's always negative. And of course, there are good reasons for that. There is a lot of suffering, and there is a lot of hatred and a lot of conflicts. But at the same time, there's a lot of hope involved, and there is a lot of redemption. I mean, many of the people who have fled have, in the long term, in the long run, found new pastures and have constructed a new life that is very fulfilling. So I think it's also important to show that it's a very complex mix of negative and positive experiences and outcomes. So you are partly an outsider, but then you get to remake yourself in a new surrounding as partly a new human being. So This is one of the themes of the book. And the filmmaking process, it's interesting that you would ask that, because at the moment there's a very good team of lady producer and female filmmaker that is making both of them American, making a film out of Lamentations of Zeno.
Okay.
And because of my experiences with the first novel, I actually told him, go ahead and do whatever you feel like. And because I realized that these two industries or these two genres are so far apart that you actually get frustrated. I mean, I'm not the first person to realize that.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, so many authors have been frustrating with their experience. It's just that so many people are involved, and it's such a long process that, to me, I think it's better to trust other people who are filmmakers, who know that particular art, and just tell them to go ahead and do it. So I'm not involved. I was involved in the very first film. It was actually a very successful film. It nearly, let me tell you this story, because this was heartbreakingly touching. So it was nominated for the Oscars as the best foreign language film, and it won the public award at a festival in Palm Springs, which normally means that you get to, because the Academy kind of looks at stuff like that. So everybody was very optimistic, and my wife is really into the Oscars. I don't care very much about that, but we started thinking about the shoes she's going to wear. And for a few weeks, there was this running gag that I would imagine, you know, how the cameras swerve from
on the red carpet,
from Cameron Diaz to Suzanne Trojanow, and stuff like that. And I said to her, well, even if I only get one ticket, you're going to get it. And it's either 5 or 6 movies that are then nominated. It was on the long list, and the short list is either 5 or 6. Anyway, it was the 6th or the 7th, so it lost by a few votes. It was like, oh, nearly there, once in a lifetime chance.
So maybe this one, maybe Lamentations of Zeno will be your ticket to the Oscars.
Red carpet.
I also want to talk about this other book that you've written that I've read, The Collector of Worlds, which has been translated into English, and which is a biography you wrote of Sir Richard.
Sorry. Charlie, I have to interrupt you, because it's far away from a biography.
Okay.
Because those people who know Richard Burton's life would immediately be very offended.
Fine. A romanticized account of the life of
completely. Yeah. I mean, most of it is invented. Actually.
Correct. Very interesting book. Sir Richard Burton, for those who don't know, we're not referring to the Hollywood actor, but was a 19th century British Army explorer who was stationed in India, then was, I think, the first European to visit Mecca, and eventually was in expeditions in East Africa. And so you cover these 3 episodes of his life. I'm just curious, sort of how you managed to, what was it like to bring together those different experiences of living in Africa, living in India? Did that involve different forms of storytelling that you took from these different traditions? Because you do structure the book in very different storytelling styles. One is his scribe in India, the other is an inquest in the Ottoman Empire, and then one of his guides in Africa. So different types of storytelling. Were you drawing from your different experiences to put that together?
Well, the storytelling structure mirrors the time philosophy of the cultures involved. So the India chapter, of course, mirrors the cyclical time concept of Hinduism and Buddhism. You actually have, most people don't know that, you have a repetition of the whole existence of the universe. So at some point, out of nowhere, God makes the universe. And then you have 4 different, they're called kalpas, so 4 different eras. It ends with the dark era. Won't surprise you to hear that we are, according to the Hindu concept, we're in the dark era. And at some point it ends in Armageddon, complete destruction. Then God takes a break, and then he restarts the whole thing. And so it's not only the cyclical idea of human life, rebirth, and so on. It's also in universal terms, things happen again and again and again. So which is why the story actually turns around itself twice. So it's chapter 1 to 32 tells you the first part, and then 33 to 64. And 64, of course, again plays around with the numerology in Hinduism. The Islam chapter, of course, because in Islam, like in Christianity, you have a chronology, you have months, of course, and you have time that is working its way towards salvation. And at the end of time is for those who are just and righteous, comes salvation. And the African concept of time is completely fragmented. So the story jumps around. The other thing is it's basically a book that 15 years before the huge discourse now on decolonialization takes certain aspects of what would a decolonialized mind look like seriously by asking the question, what would a Victorian traveler, explorer, translator, and of course, officer of the British Empire, how would he be described by the locals? So basically give the locals a voice, which is why, as you mentioned, the Indian, his Indian servant, Naukaram, fellow travelers when he did his Hajj to Mecca and Medina, and the guide. Now, the guide is an interesting fellow. His name is Sidi Mubarak Bombay, and just a few sentences about him, because that illustrates how I work. He was actually a historical figure. Interesting thing is, until today, no one has actually sat down and researched his life, although he was maybe the most important early traveler in Africa. Because one of the things I grew up, you mentioned it, I grew up in Kenya. And I remember reading a lot of books about the early travelers. And one of the things, even as a kid, that kind of irritated me or perplexed me was, how did these people find their way around without ever having been there?
Yeah.
Because I lived in Kenya and I knew, the moment you get out of your car, you're lost. So how did people come from England and then started traveling to Africa and somehow, and the explanation is very simple, and no one told me when I was in school in Kenya, the explanation is very simple. They had local guides, but the local guides are written out of history. So Sidi Mubarak Bombay is a really interesting fellow, because as a slave, he was sold to India. And that's why he's called Bombay, because those slaves that were sold in the Indian Ocean often took up the name not of their masters, like after the Middle Passage in the Americas, but of the place they arrived at. So Bombay, master dies, in his will, he is given his liberty. He goes back to East Africa, in this case, Zanzibar. And something very interesting happens, kind of early globalization. He has certain cosmopolitan skills, languages, interaction with other peoples, but he has no job. So he invents a new profession. He becomes the first guide for these Europeans the very first Europeans who are now coming to Zanzibar and saying, oh, we need to find out, what is beyond our knowledge. And he leads 4 of the most important expeditions into the inner of East Africa. Wow. So that I thought, this guy has a really fascinating story to tell. And so I had to imagine how he would tell the story. So it's inverted tables, it's upside down, it's basically looking at the shadow of colonialism and imperialism, and finding out that these shadows are actually so incredibly fascinating. They move in different ways, they have different shapes, and following these shapes and movements wherever they took me.
Fascinating. Well, it's a really fantastic book, so highly recommended to all our followers. I guess my next question is, recently they awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I'm always fascinated how they come up with like a one-line blurb on the work of an author, and they say, oh, awarded the Nobel Prize for one sentence, for masterful narrative of magic or whatever.
Yeah.
What do you think your blurb would be if and when you win the Nobel Prize? What unites this tale of climate change disintegration to 19th century explorer to the migrant family? Like,
yeah, that's a very perceptive question, because this is exactly what happened to me a few weeks back, because I know Razak personally. I actually spent a week with him in Germany. I'd invited him. We did a reading tour together, which I've been doing once a year. I invite African authors that I care about, and then we do readings together in Germany. And so I knew his work quite well. And I look at the sentence and I think to myself, gosh, this is such a banal representation of a complex work. And why would I, if I didn't know this author and I only read this one sentence, why the heck would I go and buy a book? It's like, you know, it's so, as you said, it's so abstract. And yeah, so basically, to answer your question, that number one, never as an author expect to win any prizes, because one thing most people don't understand is that I've been in many juries of many awards. It's very close to a lottery, because so many different aspects come into play. So never expect anything. But if I were to win a big prize, I would certainly hope for something longer than a sentence. So basically, the only praise that would make me happy would be a praise that is as long, let's say, as a short story. Because I think praise needs to always express and mirror the ambiguity and the ambivalence of your work, the many kind of cul-de-sacs, the one-way streets, where you got bogged down, where you kind of reach new land. You know, this journey, it has to express a journey as opposed to some concept of what you have achieved. I'm very, very skeptical of the concept of achievement in art, because I think the only really exciting thing about it is that it's a process in which you reassess your art and you reassess your way of working, not only as you're doing it, but also in between books. And it's a kind of a story of new beginnings. And each time you start a new novel, you're very, very skeptical of what you've done in the last novel. So in a way, there's always this sense of being reasonably happy with finishing a book, and at the same time knowing that if you were to write it again, you would do it differently.
Interesting. In terms of from your earliest start of your career till today, who are some of the authors or books that have influenced you or that have guided you in your career, that maybe even as a child, what were some of the books that you thought, this is what's making me want to become a writer?
Yeah, well, of course, like probably most of us who love literature, there's a certain common fare of the great storytellers that, in my case, specifically the Russian storytellers of the 19th century. So that is not very original. What is probably different with me is that because I grew up in Kenya, I started reading African literature very early. So by the time I came to Germany to study, I was quite familiar with many of the important voices of African literature. So that has been an influence. I discovered 1001 Nights quite early, which to me is one of the great books. And one of the reasons is that it's so different to the cliched idea of Oriental storytelling, which always kind of involves magic and kind of a disbelief. Wow, it's actually, in terms of the structure, a very complex book. And another thing that was very important to me since a kid is a figure called Nasreddin Hoxha. And since we spoke of this year's Nobel Prize winner, Abdel Razak Gurna, I remember discussing with him that this particular figure, Nasruddin Hoxha, who's a trickster, joker, he exists in about 45 different countries and also in Zanzibar. So Gurna grew up with him, but he had a different name. He was Guha or Juha in Zanzibar. And what really fascinates me is he's a kind of, imagine the most radical stand-up comedian, but someone who challenges everything. And then imagine that he was not written by one person, but he was actually written by society throughout the ages. So the very first stories are probably from the 8th century. And until today, in mostly Muslim countries in the world, but also in Bulgaria, people keep on telling these stories about Nasruddin Hoxha and adapting them. So they would then adapt them, let's say, to the communist regime. And that really fascinated me, this kind of big stream of humor and storytelling used as a kind of weapon against power to subvert and to express your own personal misgivings through partly really funny stories. So this is part of my philosophical makeup. So to make it more concrete, let me tell you one of my favorite Nasruddin Hoxha stories. He was invited to a concert, and it's one of these great masters of the instrument, let's say a Comanche or an oud, and everybody is in awe, and everybody says, wow. Nasruddin Hoxha is not impressed, and the host notices this and says, Mullah Nasruddin, don't you like the concert? Ah! So everybody gets really irritated. I mean, this is a great master. And after the concert, the host gives Nasruddin Hoxha the instrument and says, well, if you're so arrogant, show us what you can do. Nasruddin picks up the instrument and just strikes one note, only one note, dong, dong, dong. Everybody is aghast. I mean, you can't even play. He says, no. I have found the right note. This beginner there, and he points at the master, he's still looking for it.
Yeah, interesting.
And these are stories that you can ponder upon for years, because they're truly profound. At the same time, they work. That's why I said stand-up comedian. They just work as very good jokes. So this is always fascinating me. So to put it kind of more intellectually, the oral traditions of storytelling, which I partly noticed growing up as a Bulgarian kid, and then really noticed in Africa, and then reassessed in India, because India also had, when I went there, partly an oral storytelling tradition. This has been important to my work, which, to end this long explanation, which is why I always read my texts out aloud, the first, second, third draft, because I want them to sound as if I was somewhere, let's say on a market, and I was actually with a loud voice telling people the story. So I wanted them to be rhythmic and musical and to be orally powerful.
There's something interesting in oral histories in the sense that I would imagine they're also quite flexible and quite interpretable as they get passed on, depending on circumstances and events. Is that something you find in these African oral histories, that they sort of gradually shift as they get passed down? Or I guess especially weren't around when they were first told, I guess, but
yeah. Well, especially in the Nasruddin Hoxha stories. But then there are other stories which are very fascinating. That is, for example, when the pandemic started, many people rediscovered one of the early European books, which is the Decameron, written by Boccaccio. Because the story is that there's a horrible pandemic and a few noblemen then go to a castle and then start telling each other stories. Interesting thing is that both the structure of the Decameron, but also the individual stories are not European stories, that most of them traveled. So basically, my answer would be that I am absolutely fascinated by the capacity of stories to travel. So some of the stories that are in the Decameron are in the Indian Panchatantra or in the Hitopadesha. So in stories that were written 2000 years ago, certainly before that, they were told and retold 1,000 times before someone wrote them down. And then they traveled, let's say, in the sacks or in the side pockets of traders along the Silk Route, on donkeys or whatever, traveled to the Orient and then into Europe, of course, to Northern Africa, into Al-Andalus, Spain, and made their way all through Sicily into Italy, and made their way into our cultural bloodstream. And that is one of the beautiful things about stories is anybody who's pessimistic about literature or storytelling should remember that stories are the only way, the only cultural technique that we have to make sense of the world. And kids realize that very, very easily. I mean, kids basically, in order to make sense of what they're experiencing, tell each other stories. And without storytelling, not only is it difficult for us individually to understand what's happening with us, with the world at large, but also politically, any form of progress, of change, starts off with someone telling a story, usually something like Imagine. And a
Setting
song
out
by
a vision of sorts to the electorate.
exactly. And this kind of concentration and flowering of imagination is, I think, one of the most beautiful and one of the existentially most important aspects of humanity, which is why it's so important to safeguard that, especially in the digital age, where more and more people become consumers and less people are involved in the creative act of telling their own stories. So there's a huge difference between whether you tell your own story or you just pass on things. Because in the digital age, the passing on is often just a link that is resent. While what you were referring to is stories that are internalized, and then once they're retold, they're slightly changed. So there's an additive, there's an individual additive to each of these stories, and they become then a huge kind of stream of human consciousness through the ages. And that I think is very, very important, which is why I'm both very optimistic that storytelling will never die out as long as we have humanity, but at the same time slightly worried that we do not safeguard the imagination, especially of our kids, enough to ensure that this particular capacity and talent is can flower and develop itself.
Understood. Okay. Final question for you, Ilija. What's next for you? What are you working on these days? What projects have you got in mind in terms of upcoming books or novels or nonfiction?
I'm working on something that's very, very dear to my heart, which is I'm trying to write a utopian novel. Because part of the problem at the moment is that there's so much kind of negative energy. I mean, most of my colleagues seem to be capable of imagining some kind of
disaster, dystopia.
Yeah, exactly, some apocalyptic development. I mean, everywhere. I mean, every time I turn on the TV, there's some movie announced that basically is a ripoff on the apocalyptic visions of the Bible. So I thought to myself, we really need a story that imagines actually a better world. And at the same time, it is going back to the collective worlds, and that it has a lot of diverse voices and settings. So it's a explosion of the beauty of storytelling. So it's a lot of fun, and at the same time, it has a very kind of hard, it has a political aspiration, and it has a very sensual foundation. So that's what I've been working on for a few years now, maybe another 1.5 years to go, 2 years, I don't know.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look, that sounds amazing. I look forward to reading it when it comes out. And hopefully we can chat again at that stage and chat about that upcoming novel.
Thank you very much.
Ilija, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated speaking to you.
Welcome, most welcome.